Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Handyman in the Field. I'm Dustin and today we have an interesting topic that I don't think it's discussed very much when you're starting out. Specifically today what we're going to be talking about is when to say no to jobs. This is extremely important because I think when you're getting started, there's a lot of jobs that come your way. And there's a bunch of reasons to take them in the beginning, and there's a bunch of reasons to adjust as you go. When you're starting out, the idea is that you don't really want to turn down work. You think to yourself, you have that constant fear of whether or not you're good enough, whether or not this is going to be successful, whether or not what you're doing is going to work. So whenever work comes along, you have a tendency to say yes. And that's not always necessarily a good thing, but it is understandable when you're starting out. The biggest thing you have to realize that when you're starting out is that things are going to change. Over time, things will change and you need to learn how to adapt your business. Specifically in the beginning, I said yes to almost anything that came along. I've talked about this before about how I did some landscaping early on. I don't do that anymore. I do have a bunch of landscaping tools. If something did come up that was like a more, like a last minute pressing situation or property management related or something like that, I could take care of it. But that's not something that I do. But the important thing is to take jobs that make the most sense. You don't want to be in a situation where you're learning after the fact of a couple different things. The first thing is that not all jobs are equal. The biggest thing is that certain jobs, they initially sound simple, but because you haven't done them, you're not necessarily as familiar with doing them. You're going to run into problems. And as you run into problems, that's going to become a bigger concern. You're going to end up losing money potentially, because you underpriced it because you thought it was going to be simple, and that could actually obviously harm you. Some of them just aren't worth the time. I've talked about this before about how it's important to have a minimum. There's some customers, as a matter of fact, I just got a call the other day from a customer. They're a town, 2 towns over, but they called up and they asked, hey, I have a piece of wood. I need the piece of wood. It's a piece of plywood. I need it cut. I need it measured and cut. They didn't give me any other details. They just said, I have a piece of wood and I need it cut. Okay. So my minimum currently is $150. That's to come out. And typically, while I don't explicitly say that, that includes a lot of really basic things that would be in the range of about an hour. Now, I don't say it includes an hour because it doesn't necessarily include an hour. If they only have one thing and there's nothing else that they want me to take care of, then that, I'm still going to be charging. Because if you say hourly, as we've talked about before, you're going to run into a problem where people are going to expect you to do a number of other things. In some cases, I've had customers who they've said, hey, can you take care of this? And again, it seems simple. It seems like it's going to be straightforward, and then you get there and there's a bunch of change in plans and you've already quoted them, your minimum service trip, and now it's turning into something much larger. That happens too. So you have to be careful about stuff like that. But getting back to the most recent thing, when I explained there was $150, their immediate response was, wow, that's a lot of money to cut a piece of wood. And I would absolutely agree that is a lot of money to cut a piece of wood, but there's a lot of other avenues that are cheaper. In some cases, if you had the piece of plywood and you were about to purchase it from Home Depot, some Home Depots have the ability to cut the piece of plywood into whatever pieces you want. I've gone to plenty of Home Depots over the years to know that doesn't always work, and their machine doesn't always work, and there isn't always somebody is super available to do it, but it's free. It doesn't cost anything. Another option is you could obviously rent a tool. And when you rent the tool is going to allow you to, for maybe $30, you could rent a circular saw and then cut it. The reality is that she was looking for somebody to cut a specific piece of wood for a specific size. So she doesn't have the skill set. So you're charging for that skill set. You have the tool. they don't have the tool to cut the piece of wood. So you have to be careful, because sometimes it might seem super simple. You might think about underpricing it just because it sounds super simple, but it could end up turning into a can of worms. So you have to be very careful about the jobs that are not necessarily worth, necessarily worth the time. Another thing is, you don't want to fit, you don't want something that isn't outside of what you normally do. Now, that's not to say you can't learn and do things different. I do that all the time, but you don't want at the last minute to take something on and then realize that this is something that you can't take, you shouldn't have taken on because you don't know. You also don't want to give the impression to the customer that you don't know what you're doing by having a scenario where you're basically having to do research on site to figure out what to do in that scenario. Now, I've had that happen. It's, there's nothing, but I try to figure out a way to excuse myself from the scenario so that way I can do the research so the customer is not sitting there thinking, wow, this guy doesn't have any idea what they're doing. Well, sometimes there are situations where you have to figure out the best scenario to do that. You don't want to do, another thing is jobs that just don't make sense. If a customer doesn't give you a very clear scope of what they're looking for, that again could turn into something that you're not expecting. And when it turns into something that you're not expecting, it might not have been a good idea to say yes to that in the first place. If there's too many unknowns or there's unrealistic expectations, I've had customers where I've gone out there, I've done an estimate, I can tell that based off of some of the interaction that I had with them, either whether it be prior to seeing them in person or being in person for an estimate, I've had scenarios come up where it just doesn't make any sense to work for that customer. You can tell that they're going to be, a little picky with what they're looking for, or they're going to be very specific with the level of quality that they're getting, but also they might be complaining about how expensive it could be. So you have to balance that. Understand that there is a shortage of handymen. There is a shortage of people in the trades. It's not a stacked vocation where there's a ton of people able to do the jobs. So that being said, there's a reason why we charge what we charge. It's because we have those skills that other people don't have. They're calling you because they need someone else to do it because they either can't do it themselves or don't feel confident enough to do it themselves. So that's something to keep in mind. But the biggest thing is you don't want a job that keeps changing. This is more when you take on some bigger jobs, like more than a day's job or something like that. But if they start adding on things, and there's no discussion about, how much extra would this cost me if I did this as well? That becomes a problem because they're just assuming that because you're there, you're going to do it. And that's not a scenario you want to get yourself into. Another situation is a pricing situation. You don't want the price to be below what the work ends up being. You have to build profit into your pricing. But you also don't want to, take advantage of a customer and charge them way more than needed for something. That said, I recently heard a comparison of something that I think is very important. I think that, if you're changing a faucet for the first time, you don't have a business, you're just changing a faucet. You don't have necessarily a certain wrench that might make the job a little bit easier. You've never done this before. You don't know that you have to make sure that the water's turned off if your valves potentially are not working. You have to figure out how to do all of that stuff. As you take out the old faucet and put in the new one, there's certain things that make it go quicker as you go. Now, by no means should you be charging the same amount, or you should be charging less because you're faster, because that doesn't make any sense. You're faster because you have that experience, you have that skill. That's what they're paying for, that experience and skill. The job will get done quicker because you're more experienced. So you need to make sure that your pricing lines up with what you're doing. Always build in profit, but if you're trying to make sure that you're not overcharging a customer, let's say, for example, you go into an unknown situation. I've had this happen a couple of times where a customer's like, well, I want this done, but we don't know what the problem is. There's a couple different options. You could do a diagnosis charge, which is you come out, You just charge them a fee to basically look at the problem and try to discover what the problem is. Now, if you can't discover what the problem is, it's on you whether or not you're going to charge it. I don't typically charge for a diagnostic if I can't figure out what the problem is, but typically I can figure out what the problem is. It's just hard for them to explain what the problem is. Then you have the opportunity to upsell, obviously, to repair the problem, or you have the opportunity just to present the price for the problem. And then if they want to go, shop around for another person or compare pricing or whatever, that's up to them. But ultimately you've solved the problem and you've still not used up time determining what the problem was that they couldn't figure out in the first place. So that's something that you need to make sure that you're doing as well. When you feel like you're forcing a job based off of the pricing, you feel like the customer's not necessarily happy with the pricing, you keep lowering your price because you're trying to make sure that you can make the customer happy, you're going to put yourself in a scenario where you're not going to be happy. And if you're not happy, you could start offering not up to par customer service, which also will be the detriment to your business as well. So while not every customer is your customer, keep in mind that in order to keep your customers, you have to be happy with what you're getting in return for the service you're providing them. So that's something to keep in mind. Some more jobs that you don't want to take on, customer situations. I talked about this earlier. If they're difficult to communicate, if you insist on trying to get pictures of whatever the problem is ahead of time so that you can determine whether or not it's more extensive or not, it's not a huge ask. Occasionally I have some customers who are elderly. They're like, I don't really understand how to send pictures. It's not super common, but it does occur. There's not much you can do in those scenarios, except for either, you can again offer a diagnostic situation, or you could charge for an estimate depending on, how much work there actually is. But most of the time they can send pictures. People when you ask someone for pictures and they just don't give you pictures, they're going to be difficult. Unfortunately, that's just what will happen. I sometimes weed customers out from who I will new customers that contact me about services. I will weed them out by asking qualifying questions. Right away, I always ask, what town are you located in? If they come back and say, I need a toilet replaced, and the first question I ask is, what town are you in? Because I want to make sure that they're in my service area. Sometimes Google reaches further than I'd want it to. Not necessarily a bad thing if you're looking for work, but it is a bad thing if they are, an hour away from where you're located and somehow they just happen to be Googling handyman near me when they were closer than where their actual residence is. So there's that to keep in mind. But I try to weed them out by asking what town they're in to clarify that they're in my service area, but also then I ask for pictures. Most of the time they give pictures. There are a bunch of customers I've had where I say, can you please send me a picture of whatever it is? I had a guy about a month ago call me, leave a voicemail asking for me he said he had a gate that went in front of his driveway and he hit it. It was a vinyl gate and the hinge was bent and he can't figure out how to bend the hinge back. So he wants me to come out to take a look at it and to obviously repair it. The problem is that those types of hinges are not something that I can just go to Home Depot and buy. That's something that I might have to order from a fence supplier or source from a fence supplier. And that's not something I do on a regular basis where I can just drive up to a fence supplier that just happens to be right down the road and then have the part. If I have a picture though, I can figure out what part I need and then obviously price accordingly on how much that part is in it. He ultimately was like, well, can you just bend it back? And I was like, well, if you send me a picture, I can take a look and find out. Never got a picture and never got any further response. Sometimes that just is going to happen, but you have to think about that as those situations where you are going to be in a situation where the customer is not great at interacting with you. That's going to be a problem. I've had customers who they give me the code for their front door. They want the work done while they're at work. They don't have a problem with you being in their house. But I always say, are you going to be available if there's questions that arise? Because I don't necessarily want to quote you for a half day of work and then find out that I'm sitting there for half the day trying to find out how to take care of how you specifically want something to be taken care of because there's not enough notes. I had a customer recently, had a huge punch list of things for a house that they just moved in on. They had pictures that they wanted in certain spots. They wanted drapery rods in certain spots. When I showed up, the drapery rods were just in a stack. I had no idea which window they go to. A lot of the windows were the same. There was different rods. I had pictures that were just propped up against the wall of where they needed to go, but not any sort of like how high they wanted them or anything like that. My wife has told me that I hang pictures way too high. It's just because I'm not super tall, but I am taller. So I guess that could be a problem for people who are not as tall as me. But the point is, this customer, I specifically asked ahead of time, are you going to be available? And they said yes. And they were. I sent pictures and asked questions, and then typically they would respond back pretty quickly, or they would call me and just clarify the things I was looking for to make sure that the information was done. The last thing I want is to be told, hang a picture. I put the picture up, it's way too high for them, and I have to come back, lower it down, and now there's holes in the wall, because that's creating more work just because I didn't have the correct information ahead of time. So it's important that you get those informations. You want to stay away from those red flags with the customers. You'll learn those as you go. Unfortunately, there's not a great way of identifying those other than if they're poor at communication, they're not responding back to you in a timely manner, their demands are a little, I wouldn't say outrageous, but they're a little, outside the box of like, they start questioning pricing. Those are red flags to keep in mind, but you're going to recognize them more as you deal with more customers. Another thing, this pertains to me a lot, is time and scheduling. So I don't typically work on the weekends, and I don't typically work in evenings. I typically try to keep normal business hours during the day. There's a lot of customers who say, this happens a lot with property managers. Property managers will say, this customer is only available on evenings, or this customer is only available on the weekends. Can you go out there? Now, if I have the ability to and I don't have anything planned and it's not going to jeopardize anything that I've already got personally going on, I probably will do it if it's something quick and easy. I had something recently where I was working on Saturday where it was a drywall repair. The customer was supposedly not available during the week. Come to find out, that's just what they told the property manager because they didn't want to have to worry about it during the week. You just have to deal with those things, but it does happen. And it's going to be a lot more common when you're dealing with property managers because tenants aren't necessarily home. It's easier if you have access, but not every tenant is going to give you access to their property that they're renting to do the repair. Hopefully that can happen, but the thing is, you don't want to be taking on jobs where someone's saying immediately, I can, especially if it's a customer. Property managers are a little bit different, but if it's a customer and they're specifically saying, I need you to come only on the weekend, and you tell them, well, I don't work on the weekends, and they say, well, can you make an exception? No, you don't make an exception. I understand that you could be making money, but you're setting up a scenario where you're making an exception. That could lead to another exception. That could lead to another exception where you're going to be in a scenario where it's going to get progressively, you're going to start feeling like you're being taken advantage of because you keep making exceptions. So don't do that. One of the things you have to make sure is you can't do everything. When you start out, like I said, you're going to take on all kinds of jobs. You're going to realize very quickly that certain jobs require more effort than what you want to put into it. Certain jobs you're going to understand are not as profitable or there's other people out there, competitors in the area that are going to offer that same thing for a much lower price than what you can. You have to weed that stuff out. But in addition to weeding that stuff out, you need to think about how to narrow your scope. It's hard to do that in the beginning. I understand that. But think about the things that you're really good at and focus on trying to get those jobs more than anything. I talked a couple videos ago about Home Depot referral. Like I said on there, when you join the program, they give you a ton of options of different tasks that you can complete. When you start out, as I did, when I started out, I had a ton of things that I said I could do. And it wasn't that I couldn't do them. It was that I realized very quickly that some of these, it wasn't worth my time. It wasn't worth the effort that needed to be put in to do certain things. So I narrowed my scope. I just checked certain boxes that I knew I was very good at and I could do very well, and focused on those. And then you start gaining a reputation of getting those specific things. That's what I would suggest to do when you are starting out. Once you are more established and you have customers calling you and you have repeat customers and things like that, you can tell somebody that that's not something you do. I had a customer this week, had an electrical issue. It was definitely something that was beyond what I am licensed. I'm not licensed. I'm not a licensed electrician, so I can't take on certain things when it comes to electricity. It was replacing a light fixture that was mounted up inside the ceiling, but the whole can light, including the junction box, was going to have to get removed and a new one installed. And on top of that, all of the lights in the bathroom were not connected to GFCI. So they weren't ground circuit fault interrupter protected. And that was creating a problem. So I just had to, I politely explained what the problem was. I told them what it was, said this isn't something that I can take care of, and then I recommended a local electrician that has a good reputation and I've worked with personally, and then passed their information on to them, and hopefully that'll get taken care of. But again, you have to be careful about being able to communicate to your customers. Customers are not going to expect you to be able to do everything. They want you to be able to do everything because they would love to have somebody who can do it all. But the reality is that if you don't do something well, they would rather you tell them you don't do it well than do it, half as good as it could be if it was done by somebody who does it better. So remember that. You have to learn when to say no. You have to, and I just talked about this, but the whole idea is that if it's something that you're not comfortable doing, it's not something that makes sense pricing wise, effort wise, scheduling wise, time wise, you need to make sure that you need to know when to say no. Customers, good customers, ones that understand, customers that you're going to have come back over and over again. You're going to build a relationship of trust with them. Those customers are going to appreciate when you tell them it's something you can't do. I had one of my long-time customers ask me about something to do with roofing. I don't do anything roofing. You have to have, you have to be licensed to do roofing. Also, my insurance doesn't allow me to get on roofs, so I just don't do roofing. That said, when it comes to roofing, and I've had people like, oh, I've got a leak, can you go patch it? I cannot. That is not something I can do. I can refer you to a company that I know that's local that has a repair team that doesn't just do, full roofs, that does do just repairs, but that's as far as I can take it with that. So I think the important thing is, as we close this episode out, is that you need to know when to say no, and it needs to make sense for you. Not every job that comes your way is the job for you. You need to think about what makes sense for you and makes sense for everything that's involved with your business, whether it be pricing, your scheduling, your time, your effort. All of those things are very important for your success. If you say yes to every single job, you're going to run yourself to a point that you're not going to enjoy what you're doing. There's a lot of things that I remember doing in the very beginning of my business, and things that I look back and I say, I can't believe I even attempted to take some of that stuff on. I should have never done that. And it's for a variety of reasons. I did a lot of things in the beginning that I wish not that I did it badly, but it was just, I lost money on a lot of things because I just didn't understand how much time, or I was trying to compete price-wise with a competitor and it didn't make sense. So learn when to say no. That's important. That's the takeaway from this episode. So be sure to remember, learn to say no and when to say no to certain jobs. And not every job is a job for you, and not every customer is a customer for you. So with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching the latest Handyman in the Field. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Any comments you guys leave, I'll be sure to respond back to. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys next time.